I am glad Mett Sevedge and I are not the same age, don't live in the same town, and will probably never meet. If we did, I would become so green with envy, I couldn't finish this lecture. Let me tell you why. Mett Sevedge is mildly autistic. That's not why I'm jealous. Mett Sevedge is also an extraordinary genius. That's why the green-eyed monster takes its bite out of my ego. He is uber intelligent, and it was detectable at a very young age. Matt was playing the piano, self-taught, at age 6, but became so good that by age 7, he was enrolled at the New England Conservatory of Music. He studied not just classical music, but jazz, which became his first love, apparently. Matt was already performing with professional musicians by the ripe old age of 13, and by 2009, at the doddering age of 18, he had already released his 9th CD. Mett Sevedge has perfect pitch. He also has a prodigious memory, winning the state geography bee. He is hyperlexic, which is an ability to read at a very young age. Matt was reading at 18 months. His challenges with autism notwithstanding, Matt is a very smart, very accomplished young man. I could go on, but I will stop so that I can continue this lecture. This lecture addresses all these questions. It's divided into 3 parts. In part 1, we talk about the difficulties inherent in measuring intelligence. Part 2, we discuss 2 researchers who've tried anyway, Charles Spearman and Howard Gardner. In part 3, we talk about the synthesis we will use for the rest of this series. The practical application will concern our education system. Let's get started. Trying to get at the definition and measure of intelligence has a long and checkered history. Definitions usually include sentences like, quote, intelligence is the ability to process information in some adaptive fashion, close quote. The one measure of this sentence with which everyone is probably most familiar is the IQ test. The great-granddaddy of the modern IQ test was Alfred Binet, a 19th century French psychologist. Alfred, who died in 1911, was an interesting fellow. He was a lawyer by training, but he got his first job after years of what you might call independent study as a researcher. He was employed at a hospital in the neurology unit. Psychology and education became his lifelong passions. Alfred Binet had a surprisingly altruistic reason for designing the world's first IQ test. He was bewildered by the fact that some French students did really well in the public school system and that others were, not to put too fine a point on it, a train wreck. He wondered if he could devise an assessment that could peg early those kids most likely to fail. If that were possible, he would give those kids extra help. By inventing the IQ test, he also invented a form of special education. His first IQ test has undergone many revisions in subsequent decades and has had many champions. One of the most famous revisions, the Stanford Achievement Test, was authored by Louis Terman of Stanford University in the mid-1920s. He wanted a more Americanized test and scored people with a single number based on their performance on his exam, their IQ. His test, at one time as ubiquitous as Starbucks, was eventually called the Stanford Binet test in honor of the American school and the French author. It was heavily weighted in measuring verbal skills. The Stanford Binet test seems to have slid back into history. It's no longer the most widely used IQ test in the US. That honor belongs to the test that was designed as a reaction to Stanford Binet by an American émigré from Romania. If you are an education psychologist, you already know who I'm talking about. The Wechsler tests are what are used, named after noted psychologist David Wechsler. He was really peeved that Stanford Binet placed so much emphasis on verbal skills. He wanted one that also measured nonverbal skills, like math. There are now many versions of the Wechsler tests, and even more reactions against them. Are you detecting a pattern here? I am, and that leads me to the fact that I am also detecting a problem. Whatever IQ test you are looking at, Stanford Binet, Wechsler, or the puzzles in Parade magazine, you can interrogate them with an extremely simple question. From a neurological perspective, exactly what does an IQ test measure? You might be surprised by the answer. From a brain science perspective, we have no idea what IQ tests measure. That's an extremely dissonant thing to say, I know, given their popularity. Controversy runs through this issue like marbling in a rib steak. But there's good news. Like every other meaty dispute, it only fosters a hunger for more questions. Given that the brain science is no help, one of the biggest questions is behavioral and fundamental. Can you really describe the great symphony of human intellectual talent with a single immutable number? And is that number all that immutable? IQ tests have been shown to vary a great deal depending upon your socioeconomic status, the year you were born, even the mood you're in when you're taking the exam. The variability is so strong that some people think that IQ tests mostly measure your ability to take IQ tests. I don't mean to be entirely pessimistic. Recursive as they might be, IQ tests do have some value. They can predict your ability to be successful at school. IQ tests can distinguish kids most likely to experience difficulties in school from kids most likely to succeed, which is what Alfred Binet had in mind in the first place. But the fact that these ideas might have severe shortcomings led a larger number of researchers to look for other ways to measure intelligence. We're going to look at two in the second part of our series, Charles Spearman and Howard Gardner. We're going to look at an influential member of this insurgency, a man named Charles Spearman, but only after a slight detour. To talk about Spearman's contribution to understanding intelligence, we're going to pay a visit to a rockabilly musician who probably never heard of Spearman. His name was 60s country and western star Marty Robbins. Marty Robbins had two interesting careers, one of which makes a useful analogy for discussing intelligence. Like I said, Marty was a musician, a chart-topping cowboy guitar player who was one of the most successful rockabilly country artists of all time. He is one of those rare 1960s musicians who also had his hits on the pop charts. His musical career coincided with another activity of his, the one upon which we'll focus. Marty Robbins was also a competition-grade NASCAR race car driver. He successfully competed in 35 formal NASCAR events, finishing in the top 10 in 6. It's those cars, specifically the gas in those cars, I'd like to discuss. Marty drove different kinds of cars in his career, mostly Fords and Dodges, later a Buick. Regardless of the make of the car, he always had to put gas in them to go, just like all drivers. NASCAR uses a special blend designed for high performance, and it delivers, whether you're driving a Ford or a Dodge or your mother's Buick. Regardless of the car, NASCAR drivers all use this special gas. That idea of a special gas that drives high performance regardless of the vehicle is what we'll use to describe the ideas of Charles Spearman. Spearman hypothesized that human intelligence was partly fueled by a kind of high-performance neurological gas. He called this gas G, appropriately enough, but short for general intelligence. This gas, this G, affects human intellectual talent irrespective of the brain being examined, just like real gas runs real cars irrespective of the vehicle. Many researchers have concluded the core of what we call human smartness is really just G. The concept of G is not to be confused with the concept of IQ. It might be instructive to summarize how Spearman arrived at his concept just to keep the concepts distinctive. Spearman was trying to solve a puzzle, noticed in kids who actually took the Stanford Binet IQ tests. Kids who did well in math tended to do well verbally also, and they were usually terrific problem solvers. He saw the same thing in school. Kids who did well in one class, like math, tended to do well in other classes, like language arts. It was an imperfect correlation, Spearman readily admitted, and there were certain other more specialized ingredients necessary to make people good at, say, calculus. But he was adamant these general associations were real. To him, they reflected some underlying cognitive process IQ tests could only imperfectly describe. So he came up with G and a way to measure it. G tests involve measuring positive statistical correlations between scores on a wide series of tasks, something very different from how IQ is formulated. The G tests have proven to be quite robust in predicting academic performance. It also predicts future job performance. Here's a quote from researcher David Lewinsky, cited in the book Psychology, The Science of Mind and Behavior. G is clearly the most important dimension of individual differences uncovered in the study of cognitive abilities to date. So, does that settle the question about measuring human intelligence? Is it all just G? Not so fast, said another group of researchers. Though G as a concept holds up really well, it doesn't describe everything in the human experience of intelligence. Even Spearman, the sire of G, was clear in saying that G didn't describe everything in the human intellectual landscape. This led to a group of researchers amending Spearman's work. Let me give you an example of why they amended Spearman's work by describing another musical savant. His name is Derek Paravicini, and he was interviewed at age 30 by Leslie Stahl in a piece for 60 Minutes. The segment starts with Derek playing the piano, which he does very well. His memory for music is, in fact, off the charts. Says Leslie, Derek was excited to show us the skills that make him so exceptional. His ability to instantly call up any piece of music he has ever heard, like the Village People's YMCA. Derek then pounds out YMCA. He plays My Favorite Things from the musical Sound of Music. He can even improvise musical styles over pieces of music on command, playing My Favorite Things in the style of Oscar Peterson, then quickly switching to a David Brubeck version. Okay, another musical genius. But not just any musical genius. What makes this story so exceptional is what Derek cannot do. Early in the 60 Minutes piece, Leslie asks Derek to hold up 3 fingers. You might be astonished to know Derek can't do it. He struggles, then says to Leslie, I don't know how to do it. And he doesn't. Leslie has to show him. And that's not all. Derek can't keep track of his finances. He has severe learning disabilities. He is blind. Leslie intones, quote, Derek is a musical savant blessed with an island of extreme talent in a sea of profound disability, close quote. No one would quibble with the fact that Derek Paravicini is a genius. No one would quibble with the fact Derek Paravicini is severely learning disabled. Where is Derek's IQ in the middle of all of this? Where is Derek's G in the middle of all of this? Are those even the right questions to ask? The bottom line is that we just don't know. Derek's intellect is uneven, and that's the point. It's nice to have G, but it's not the whole story for Derek. It may not even be the whole story for anybody, including you. Perhaps a better way of looking at human intelligence involves blowing up the concept of cognitive capability as a unifying neurological concept. Maybe our mental aptitudes are better represented by thinking of them as semi-autonomous modules. They might be yoked together in a combinatorial fashion to solve some problem related to survival, or they may act as more independent agents. This could explain Derek. He obviously had a music module, but he certainly did not have a counting on your fingers module. Other researchers felt like the ideas of IQ and G needed a fresh coat of paint. Some went on field trips, going out into the real world to see the type of intellectual skills people deployed as they lived their lives in their natural settings. Kind of like a cognitive Jane Goodall. One of the most famous advocates of this multiple modules approach is Harvard psychologist Howard Gardner. His point of view is summarized succinctly in this quote from his landmark book, Multiple Intelligences. Note how Howard indirectly imputes both IQ and G in this quote. I believe that we should get away altogether from tests and correlations among tests and look instead at more naturalistic sources of information about how peoples around the world develop skills important to their way of life. He came to believe that there were at least 8 types of intelligence that people deploy in their lives, maybe even 9. They included the usual suspects measured in bygone eras, such as verbal linguistic intelligence, logical mathematical intelligence, visual spatial intelligence. But he also included unusual things, like bodily kinesthetic intelligence, musical rhythmic intelligence, and 2 types of emotional intelligence. The first he called interpersonal intelligence. That's a social skill. It's the ability to understand and to be sensitive to the emotions and feelings of others. The second he termed intrapersonal intelligence. This is the ability to understand, amongst other things, your own intellectual and emotional landscape. It's a form of self-awareness whereby you understand your assets and limitations, your strengths and your weaknesses. The insight that our emotional abilities may have their form of intelligence was a first, and I can find no better illustration of this type of intelligence than telling you about a truly strange contest that occurred in 1968. According to the book, A Third Serving of Chicken Soup for the Soul, America once decided to find the most caring child, kind of a pediatric beauty contest for the heart. They asked a professor from the University of Southern California and a famous self-help guru, Dr. Leo Buscaglia, to be the judge. Here's an account of the winner of this contest, a little boy. Quote, "The purpose of the contest was to find the most caring child. The winner was a 4-year-old child whose next-door neighbor was an elderly gentleman who had recently lost his wife. Upon seeing the man cry, the little boy went into the old gentleman's yard, climbed onto his lap, and just sat there. When his mother asked him what he had said to the neighbor, the little boy said, 'Nothing. I just helped him cry.'" Chief amongst these criticisms is that the categories are more or less arbitrary, based on nothing more than Howard's opinion. Definitions are a problem too. Many in the brain research community believe there is no such thing as emotions, to give just one disconcerting example. Surprising, I know. Most of us look at emotions and feel they are a real phenomenon. Only as long as you don't look too closely. In the cold, hard world of neuroscience, everything in the brain consists of just patterns of electrical stimulations. Some patterns produce certain experiences. Other patterns produce different experiences. What pattern constitutes an emotion and what pattern constitutes a cognition gets to be arbitrary after a while. And in a similar vein, we still don't really know what intelligence is. So, what are we going to do? At the same time people were trying to figure out ways to characterize the behaviors of intelligence, other researchers took a look at the molecules of intelligence. Researchers have attempted to characterize the genes of human smartness. Now, you might say to yourself, how can we find a gene for something like smartness when we don't even know what it is, and so don't know what we're looking for? That's a good point. Researchers have struggled with this, using perilous paper and pencil tests like IQ and G as flashlights as they explore the underworld of human genes. Researchers have discovered that genetics do play a role in determining smarts, at least if you think IQ or G says something about intelligence. This is mainly determined through correlational scores. It might be instructive to talk about correlational scores before turning to the data. If intelligence were mediated exclusively by genes, completely heritable, any two people with identical genetic backgrounds would have a correlational score of 1.0. That's a perfect association between intelligence and genetic background. Solid vote for the double helix. Are there people who have identical genetic backgrounds? There sure are. That's what identical twins are. What's their correlational score related to intelligence? At least as measured by IQ? Is it 1.0? It should be if intelligence were completely heritable. Here's where things get interesting. The answer is no. It's not 1.0. If twins are raised in the same household, the correlational score is actually 0.86. This is not a perfect score. The interpretation is straightforward, something confirmed in study after study. Genes play a big fat role in intelligence, but it's not the only factor. What about identical twins that were separated at birth but raised in different households? Their score is not 1.0 either. Surprisingly, it's not even 0.86, which is the score you get if they shared the same dinner table. The score of identical twins raised separately is 0.75. That tells us there are even more factors to consider when attempting to find the genes of intelligence. Do we know what some of these additional factors are? Well, some of them involve the educational level of the house. Some of them involve income. There are even suggestions that the decade in which you are born plays a role. We return to a familiar refrain, that there is both nature and nurture when considering complex human behavior. We have yet to untangle the relative contributions of each to intelligence. So, what are we going to do given this turbulence? It seems there are no end of proposals to follow. In part 3 of this lecture, I outlined the idea that intelligence is a synthesis of what we call crystallized and fluid intelligence capabilities. This is the synthesis we will use for the rest of this series. So, let's get started. Let's keep with the central theme of this lecture series, that the brain is a sophisticated survival organ. Let's also remember variable selection theory from lecture number 1. We survived because we could adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, that what we adapted to was change itself. We can then ask a practical question, leaving the ambiguity to further research. What cognitive gadgets in the brain best aided our ability to survive the ever-changing environment of Northeast Africa? A model I think answers this question best is an old one, first championed by researchers Ray Cattell and John Horn in the middle years of the 20th century. To understand their ideas, I need to talk about another Horn, staying in the previous century but turning away from science for a moment. This horn is a jazz horn, played by one of the great titans of 20th century jazz improvisation, Miles Davis. People not familiar with the brilliance of Miles Davis are often familiar with his quirks. He had a temper. Miles often played with his back to the audience. At a concert in New York's Beacon Theater, he turned his back to the crowd and marched to a row of synthesizers. He then played the keyboards with one hand and his trumpet with the other. Like I said, he was brilliant and quirky. Though Miles is considered one of the great improvisers of music, many people don't know he first studied at Juilliard. In his autobiography, Miles claimed Juilliard gave him a long-lasting gift, a solid grounding in formal music theory. He said his knowledge would later prove valuable in this later career. One of the greatest jazz improvisers of all time actually lists formal music theory as a reason for his success. We have in Miles Davis twin ideas: unbelievable instincts for improvisation, memorized grounding in a discipline. This idea that you use previous knowledge to improvise solutions to present problems lies at the heart of the ideas of Cattell and Horn. They took Spearman's idea of G and split it into two categories of intelligence based on what could be called the philosophy of Miles Davis. The first category is called crystallized intelligence, or GC. This is the ability to learn from experience, constructing a database retrievable on demand. You got scorched when you put your hand on an orange-colored burner on a stove. You recall this experience the next time you see a hot stove using your crystallized intelligence and move away. Crystallized intelligence is that suite of gadgets that allows you to memorize and recall. Those who could remember experience best might have a distinct survival advantage over those who could not. This is the equivalent of learning music theory. Interestingly enough, crystallized intelligence skills tend to get better as you get older, something like wine, perhaps unlike Miles. The second category they termed fluid intelligence, GF. This is roughly the ability to improvise off the database established with your crystallized talents. You got scorched on an orange-colored burner on a stove. Now you see an orange-colored fire in a fire pit. That's not a stove, but still you stay away from it. That's improvising, coming to conclusions in reactions to situations with which you have no direct experience. You create unique combinations from the database, in this case, solving a pattern matching problem. Such creative, inductive problem-solving ability is the hallmark of fluid intelligence. This is just like a jazz musician using previously acquired music theory to improvise new things. Interestingly enough, fluid intelligence skills do not improve with age. The skills reach their maximum in your early 20s, then begin a long, slow decline. Want to see a terrific example of this pattern matching? Here's a famous brain teaser. Your goal is to find the next symbol. I will give you a hint. This is an infinite series, so there are infinite next symbols. Give up? The solution is this. You are looking at a consecutive row of numbers. This is the heart of fluid intelligence, working with crystallized intelligence. You already know about numbers from preschool. That's the crystallized stuff. Now you have to improvise off of that knowledge to solve a problem in pattern matching. That's the fluid stuff. We obviously used both types of intelligence to survive the wild, woolly world of the meteorologically unstable Serengeti. Those people who had them working in concert, quickly absorbing the knowledge the world had to offer, then improvising off of it, could adapt to changes much more quickly than those who could not. It's possible that Horn and Cattell are onto something. While not describing everything about human intelligence, the interplay between crystallized and fluid intelligence processes may hold enough explanatory power to answer a few practical questions. Here's one I encounter a lot. I am often asked when I give public lectures if the brain sciences, writ as large as you like, has anything practical to say about the way we should teach our children. Should we emphasize rote memorization, for which certain cultures are famous? Should we emphasize innovation and creativity, for which other cultures are equally famous? The answer I give sometimes surprises my audience. I am deeply skeptical about applying anything in the brain sciences to classroom practice. At this stage in our knowledge, we don't know how your brain knows your name. So I usually say, no. The jury is still way out. I have, for better or worse, a scientific bit in my mouth. So then I'm asked about my opinion about how we should teach children. If I have no reason to promote a certain method, style, or program, I then respond a little more charitably. If you want my opinion, I intone, I am happy to inflict it on you. I then haul out horn and cattell and begin pontificating. And then I say two things. Number one, if our evolutionary history required us to integrate both memorization and improvisation to survive, then it's almost certainly true that these methods of learning are still with us. We have not been an organized civilization long enough to have that tendency beat out of our learning abilities. Number two, any school system that emphasizes only one side of our capabilities and ignores, or mostly ignores, the other is like a plane flying with only one wing. Those systems that emphasize rote memorization, crystallized intelligence, at the expense of creative improvisation are inadequate. They are in danger of creating mini Google search engines out of the children in their classrooms. You might as well skip the effort because computers can memorize and retrieve information better, faster, and with greater accuracy. In my opinion, emphasizing only crystallized models is insufficient. Those systems only emphasizing creative improvisation, leaving out the tough it out, memorize this darn it side of learning, are equally faulty. They are primarily exercising fluid intelligence skills at the expense of crystallized processes. The ability to improvise is hampered if there is no learned fund of knowledge from which to create, whereas crystallized, mostly models are in danger of creating robots. Fluid, mostly models are in danger of creating flakes. Miles Davis said it best when he described how to do jazz. Don't play what's there. Play what's not there. That's great coming from Mr. Juilliard, for you cannot know what's not there until you first know what is there. In the next two lectures, we are going to look more closely at these two skills, crystallized first, fluid second. What we'll find out is that Miles' words end up being good advice to follow whether you are a musician or a student, or someone simply interested in learning how we used our brains to survive the savannah and then take over the world.